The discovery of the cabin. The forest was alive, but not in the way nature should be. There was no birdsong, no rustle of harmless creatures in the underbrush, no natural signs of life. Instead, the forest of Black Hollow pulsed with an eerie energy, as though it were aware of their every step. Emily, the leader of the group, had been holding the map so tightly that her fingers were cramping. The crude lines and markings she had copied from the villagers' reluctant descriptions felt more like a riddle than a guide. Beside her, Mark cleared a path through the thick foliage, his machete hacking at vines that seemed almost to slither back into place after each swing. Lisa, the documentarian, lingered near the rear, pausing frequently to film the oppressive surroundings, while Jake, their self-proclaimed skeptic, grumbled as he stumbled over roots and stones. "Tell me again why we're doing this?" Jake called out, his voice echoing slightly in the unnaturally still air. "To find the truth," Emily replied without turning. Her voice was firm, but the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her. "The legends about this place have been around for centuries. No one has documented it properly. This could be groundbreaking. Or it could be the stupidest thing we've ever done," Jake muttered. Mark stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The group froze. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves above and their own breathing. Then faintly came something else, a low hum, almost imperceptible, like the forest was whispering. "It's just the wind," Lisa said, though she didn't sound convinced. "There's no wind," Mark countered, his grip tightening on the machete. The group moved forward cautiously, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The path became less defined, the trees closing in around them like prison bars. The hum grew louder, morphing into a soft, almost melodic chant. Emily's eyes darted to the map. "We're close. I think." "You think?" Jake hissed. "That's comforting. No one's been out here in decades," Emily shot back. "This isn't exactly a well-worn trail." Suddenly, the dense wall of trees gave way to a clearing, and there it stood, the cabin. It was a structure that didn't belong in any world governed by reason. The cabin looked as though it had grown from the forest itself, its wooden frame twisted and gnarled like the surrounding trees. The roof sagged under the weight of moss and decay, and the windows were jagged holes, dark and hollow. Strange symbols covered the walls, etched deeply into the wood and glowing faintly, as though imbued with their own light. He followed reluctantly. Inside, the air was stifling. Every breath felt like inhaling ash. Emily approached the table and gingerly touched the book. The leather was cold, almost wet. "Don't open that," Jake said sharply. Emily ignored him, her curiosity too strong. She flipped open the cover, revealing pages filled with indecipherable text and crude drawings. The first image was of a woman, her face contorted in agony, bound to a tree. The next page showed the same woman, her body twisting into something monstrous. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, peering over her shoulder. "It's a journal," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Or a spell book?" Lisa moved closer, her camera capturing the grotesque illustrations. "This is unbelievable." The whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake backed toward the door. "I'm not staying here. This place is wrong." Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped, spinning toward the sound. "It's just the wind," Lisa said, though her voice wavered. "There's no wind," Mark reminded her, his knuckles white around the handle of the machete. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. They weren't random sounds, they were words. Words in a language none of them recognized but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a chill through Emily's spine. She clutched the book tightly as though it might protect her. The floor beneath them creaked, the sound resonating like a groan of protest. Shadows began to move in the corners of the room, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. "What the hell is happening?" Jake shouted, his voice rising in panic. Emily turned to the others, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now." But when they tried the door, it wouldn't budge. Story number 2. The first night. The sun was setting quickly, and the encroaching darkness brought a chill that seemed to seep from the forest itself. The group had no choice but to stay the night in the cabin. None of them dared to venture back into the woods after dark, not after what they had seen and felt. The door had finally opened after an excruciating moment of panic, but stepping outside hadn't felt any safer. The forest was suffocating, its trees looming like silent sentinels, and the whispers seemed louder out there. Emily had made the decision. they would stay inside the cabin, despite its ominous aura. They set up their sleeping bags on the dusty floor, carefully avoiding the strange symbols carved into the walls and floorboards. Lisa lit a lantern, its dim glow casting flickering shadows that danced in unsettling patterns. "This place is straight out of a nightmare," Jake muttered, sitting cross-legged near the door, his back pressed against the wall. He clutched a flashlight like it was a weapon. "It's not like we have a choice," Emily replied, her tone sharper than she intended. Her nerves were frayed and she could feel the weight of the group's fear pressing down on her. Lisa was studying the book Emily had found, her fingers tracing the cracked leather cover. "This thing feels wrong," she said softly. "Then maybe don't touch it," Jake snapped. "It's just a book," Lisa retorted, but she set it down anyway as though it had burned her. Mark had been silent for most of the evening, sitting near the boarded-up window with his machete resting across his lap. He stared into the darkness outside, his jaw tight. "Do you think this is where it happened?" he asked suddenly. "What?" Emily turned to him, frowning. "The witch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The villagers said she was tied to a tree, tortured, killed. Maybe this cabin was hers." The thought hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. "No," Emily said firmly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "This place is just old. Abandoned. That's all." Lisa snorted. "You saw those symbols, Emily. You felt that, whatever that was earlier. Don't pretend this is just some forgotten shack." A heavy silence followed her words. As night fell, the whispers began again. They started softly like the rustling of leaves but soon grew louder, clearer. They came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the shadows. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Of course we hear it," Jake snapped. "What do you want us to do about it?" "Quiet," Mark said sharply. He stood, gripping his machete tightly, his eyes scanning the room. "It's not just whispers anymore." The group fell silent, straining to hear. There it was, a faint sound barely discernible beneath the whispers. A soft tapping like fingernails against wood. "It's coming from the trapdoor," Lisa whispered. They all turned to look at the floor, where a trapdoor lay partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. It was small, with rusted hinges and a handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Jake shook his head vehemently. "No. No way. We're not opening that." Emily stepped closer to the trapdoor, her flashlight illuminating the edges. The tapping grew louder. "Emily," Mark warned. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. "What if it's just—" "Don't," Jake snapped. "Don't say it's nothing. Nothing taps from under a floor." But Emily's curiosity was too strong. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit them first, a nauseating stench of rot and decay. Emily gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve. "Jesus Christ," Mark muttered, stepping back. Emily shone her flashlight down the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing dirt walls lined with shelves. Jars filled with murky liquid and strange shapes lined the shelves, and a pile of bones lay in the corner. "What the hell is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. Emily didn't answer. She descended the stairs slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The others followed reluctantly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they found a small chamber, its walls covered in the same symbols that adorned the cabin above. A stone altar stood in the center, stained dark with something they didn't want to identify. "Is this some kind of ritual site?" Mark asked, his voice hushed. Lisa moved closer to the altar, her camera shaking in her hands. She froze, her eyes widening. "There's something carved into it?" Emily leaned closer, her flashlight illuminating the words. They were written in an ancient language, but somehow she understood them. "She watches. She waits. She hungers." A loud bang echoed from above, making them all jump. "What the hell was that?" Jake hissed, his eyes darting toward the stairs. "Something's up there," Mark said, gripping his machete. They scrambled back up the stairs, their fear mounting with every step. When they reached the main room, they found the door wide open, swinging slightly in the cold night breeze. "I thought we locked that," Lisa whispered. "We did," Emily said, her voice tight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. The lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. "Stay together," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. The door slammed shut again, the sound reverberating through the cabin. The lantern went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. "Turn on the flashlight." Lisa cried, her voice trembling. Emily fumbled with her flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. None of them worked. The whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and filled with malice. Then the cabin fell silent. "Is it over?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, raising his machete. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then a voice, low and rasping, came from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." A figure emerged from the shadows, its form barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face obscured by a veil of black hair. Lisa screamed, stumbling back and dropping her camera. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Mark lunged at it with the machete, but the blade passed through it as though it wasn't there. The figure let out a low, inhuman growl, and Mark was thrown back as though struck by an unseen force. "Run!" Emily shouted, grabbing Lisa and pulling her toward the door. The group scrambled outside, the cold night air a shocking contrast to the oppressive heat of the cabin. They ran blindly into the forest, the whispers following them like a swarm of angry bees. But the forest was different now. The trees twisted and shifted, their branches reaching out like claws. The path they had followed earlier was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of darkness. "We're trapped," Jake gasped, collapsing against a tree. Emily looked around, her chest heaving. "No, we can't be. There has to be a way out." The laughter started again, echoing through the trees. Lisa clutched Emily's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "It's playing with us." Mark staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." As they stumbled through the forest, the whispers grew louder, the laughter more sinister. Shadows flitted between the trees, and the air grew colder with every step. Eventually they found themselves back at the cabin. "No," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "We've been walking in circles." The cabin loomed before them, its dark windows like empty eyes. The door was open, waiting for them. "We're not going back in there," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We don't have a choice," Emily said, her tone grim. "Whatever's out here is worse." Reluctantly they stepped back inside, the door closing behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down their spines. The cabin was silent now, the whispers gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, an oppressive weight pressing down on them. They huddled together, their backs to the wall, waiting for the dawn that seemed impossibly far away. Story number 3. Descent into Madness. The cabin was alive. It was no longer a question of superstition or imagination. The group could feel it in every creak of the wood, every shift of the shadows, every oppressive breath of air that seemed to pulse with a sinister intent. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. Something deeper had awakened, and it was hungry. Emily sat near the corner of the room, clutching the cracked leather book to her chest like a talisman. She hadn't opened it since the altar room, but its presence felt heavier, as though it was absorbing the chaos around them. She stared at the walls, their strange symbols seeming to writhe in the flickering lantern light. Lisa crouched by the window, her camera resting uselessly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since they'd returned to the cabin. Her face was pale, her wide eyes fixed on the forest outside. Mark paced back and forth, his machete gripped tightly in his hand. His movements were jerky, restless, and his breathing had become shallow and erratic. Jake sat slumped against the door, his flashlight dead in his lap. He stared at the ground, muttering to himself, his lips forming words that no one else could hear. "Are we just going to sit here?" Mark snapped suddenly, breaking the oppressive silence. His voice was sharp, filled with anger and fear. But Mark ignored her, striding to the center of the room and yanking the trapdoor open. The stench of rot wafted up, stronger than before. "There's something down there," he said, his knuckles white around the machete. "Mark, don't," Lisa pleaded, her voice breaking. But Mark descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Emily grabbed the lantern and followed, unable to let him go alone. Lisa hesitated for a moment before joining them, leaving Jake alone in the cabin above. The chamber below was darker than before, the symbols on the walls seeming to glow faintly. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Mark stood by the altar, staring at something on the floor. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Mark pointed, and Emily shone the lantern's light toward the ground. A pool of black liquid was spreading from beneath the altar, its surface rippling as though alive. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, stepping back. The liquid began to move, flowing toward them with unnatural speed. "Run!" Mark shouted, shoving Emily toward the stairs. They scrambled back up, slamming the trapdoor shut behind them. "What's happening?" Jake demanded, his voice rising in panic. Before anyone could answer, the walls began to tremble. The symbols carved into the wood glowed brighter, and the whispers turned into screams. "It's the book," Lisa said suddenly, pointing at Emily. "It's because of the book?" Emily clutched the book tighter. "We don't know that." "Then get rid of it," Lisa shouted, her voice cracking. "No," Emily snapped. "What if this is the only way to stop it? Or what if it's what's keeping this thing alive?" Mark growled. The argument was cut short by a deafening crash. The door flew open and the figure from before stepped inside. Its movements were unnatural, its limbs bending at impossible angles. "Get back!" Mark shouted, raising his machete. The figure tilted its head, its face obscured by shadow. Then it lunged. Mark swung the machete, but the figure moved with inhuman speed, returned to the cabin, closing the door behind them. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wood sending shivers down their spines. Emily placed the book on the table, flipping through its pages. The text seemed to shift and writhe, the letters forming and reforming before her eyes. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "I'm trying to figure out how to stop it," Emily said, her eyes scanning the pages. "And what if you make it worse?" Lisa demanded. Emily didn't answer. She found a page with a drawing of the altar and the symbols that surrounded it. Beneath the image were instructions written in the strange, shifting text. "What does it say?" Mark asked, peering over her shoulder. Emily hesitated, the words twisting in her mind. "It says, a sacrifice is needed." "A sacrifice?" Lisa repeated, her voice rising. "Are you kidding me?" Emily's hands trembled as she turned the page. The next image showed a figure kneeling before the altar, a knife in its hand. "No," Mark said firmly. "We're not doing that." "We don't have a choice," Emily said, her voice breaking. "If we don't, this thing will kill us all."